I'm joined now by Tomás Ryan, Associate Professor at the School of Biochemistry and Immunology at Trinity, Alan Barrett, Director of the ESRI, and Eoghan Corry, travel journalist, who is a member of the Tourism Recovery Task Force. Tomás Ryan, I'll start with you because your group, the Independent Scientific Advisory Group, you're calling for a full national lockdown starting on the 26th of December. How different is that to what is likely to come from Cabinet?
Well, what we're calling for is very different because what we're calling for is a national strategy. What we're calling for is a strategy that allows us to open up the economy, a strategy that makes this lockdown our last lockdown, such that we don't have to go through rolling lockdowns for most of 2021. To that end, we have already published a 7-point plan for how we can aggressively suppress the virus and keep it suppressed as society opens up. And the first point on that plan is we need to suppress the virus to about 10 cases a day or less. And we've done that before. And the closer we get to zero community transmission, the better. Because we cannot expect our test trace isolation infrastructure and our public health physicians to suppress the virus when it's at hundreds of cases a day. It's not possible. So the first point is to get it down to very low numbers. Now, you want to get it down as fast as possible. So the more aggressive the measures and the earlier we put them in place, the less time that we'll all have to spend in lockdown.
But how long do you think this lockdown that you're recommending would last?
We think that we should start on St. Stephen's Day or the day after. The reason for this is that is when Northern Ireland are going to start their hard 6-week lockdown. And so we can reinforce each other's lockdowns through that process. But we're starting in a better position than them, so it's possible we could exit it more early. But it would be a mistake to go in with a weaker lockdown because that always ends up with people spending more time there. There are other things we can do to accelerate it also. The fact that schools are closed is a huge bonus because we know that schools being open slows the effectiveness of lockdowns. We could delay school opening by a couple of weeks by borrowing from the summer. We should focus on protecting our low COVID counties and provinces. So Munster could possibly open up before other parts of the country. Okay. We should be investing in mass antigen testing. That would also accelerate how quickly the lockdown happens. But the most important thing is not to make the same mistakes as last time. And the two major mistakes we made after lockdown one, even though we did get to small numbers, was firstly not supporting test trace isolate in an agile enough manner. And secondly, that we were not at all taking travel restrictions seriously. And we see that the country with new virus and now with the new variant, this is particularly a concern. So we need to have a proper sense after we suppress the virus so that we can open up, so that we can open. We think opening restaurants by St. Valentine's Day, if we got it right, and opening wet pubs before St. Patrick's Day and then keeping them both open.
And what's the travel strategy then in your plan?
It's probably the most difficult decision. There are no easy choices here. But I think that the difficult decision, the Rubicon that we have to cross, is to follow the successful countries. There are many successful countries that have aggressively suppressed or eliminated the virus. And the crucial thing is not letting it into the country. That doesn't mean putting a fence around the island. It does mean having mandatory 2-week quarantine, possibly 10-day quarantine for people coming into the country. This is what happens in Australia, in South Korea, etc. Okay. And this could be good business, of course, for hotels, particularly Dublin hotels. But the idea is that if we don't do that, then just so a handful or a subset of the people in the country can travel, because let's face it, most of us, for business or pleasure, are not traveling, but we're all locking down more to cover the costs of a subset of the population that are travelling.
Well, Eoghan Corry, what do you make of that idea that we should go in hard, get it done so that we can get back to normal, and that includes mandatory quarantine for those who are willing and want to travel?
It would all make sense if it worked. The history of it is that it hasn't worked. I do kind of see Tomás's very valid point that countries that have locked down hard have brought the virus under control. You would think that by looking at two of the examples that he pulled up, there are loads of examples of countries that locked down hard. Jersey would be a very good example. Their rate is 6 times ours and they've had a complete travel ban. It's the cause and the effect. If it worked, it would make sense to cause the carnage, the economic carnage of the sort of measures that he's proposing, and were proposed way back in March and thankfully discarded then, the sort of drawbridge up mentality. We are not sure. It's quite clear it works. It doesn't work. It actually, the cause and effect aren't completely related. Some of the countries that locked down very, very hard on international travel are some of the worst affected. Others have done very well. We could play a parlour game all day naming countries, but it certainly is not the solution for Ireland, which needs to stay connected and is one of the most, started off this as one of the most connected islands in the world, and now is looking across the chart of Europe as the country worst affected in terms of international connectivity.
And you have an issue with this.
It's been bad medicine.
You have an issue with the UK travel ban, the ban that 40 countries have implemented. They do not want to see people from the UK arriving in their countries. You say that's wrong.
You see, pulling up the drawbridge is a 14th century response. It's how everybody responds. And the international travel is far more sophisticated than that. Their track and trace is beyond anything that is available within the community. The way the aviation sector manages risk is a model for the medical community. And the World Trade Organization, or the World Health Organization, came out of the previous crisis. A lot of strategy is based on previous crisis because we know so little about the current one, even after 9 months, said out of the Ebola and H1N1, closing borders can actually make the situation worse.
Beyond that, the other aspect to this, the hospitality industry now looking today at having to close on the 26th. I know it's been said time and again that the evidence isn't there from people like you and people who work in that industry. They say that they have not seen that the case numbers are there emanating from their activities.
That's where where the problem is from the viewpoint of the hospitality industry. The number of cases, like the clusters associated with hotels, for instance, is 12 out of 10,000. So the data isn't that the hospitality, travel, tourism industries are major contributors to this. What we have seen, though, from Nphet is that they're like the injured dog that keeps biting its owner, or the government direction that it comes from Nphet has turned on the hospitality sector and continued to punish it for a crisis which all of us are scared by. In a way, Tomás is doing exactly what he's supposed to do. He's the scientist looking at the data saying, let's get the case numbers way, way down. As media, we sort of ham it up a little bit. Twitter's job is to run around with the pitchforks and the torches, but the government has to decide, when all of these converging data sets are coming together, where is going to solve the problem? What are we going to do to solve the problem without causing disproportionate economic damage?
All right, but let's talk about...
over the last 9 months,
and I want to bring in Alan Barrett
the
here.
sort of clear-headed strategy, and that's great that Tomás's group is talking about strategy to save 2021.
Alan Barrett, when it comes to the economy, the cold hard cash of all of this, the hospitality industry says we are not to blame. What is the impact going to be of shutting that sector down again?
Well, obviously, the impact is going to be very, very bad for the sector itself. But I think we have to sort of recognise increasingly that huge parts of the economy are actually still operating. And quite surprisingly and quite bizarrely, it looks like the Irish economy in terms of GDP is actually going to grow in 2020. Now, this is a really, really important point because I think unlike where we were, say, last March, there was a real sort of sense that, the economy was going to go into free fall. And while the government at the time was borrowing a huge amount of money to sort of support both sectors and individuals that were being negatively affected, we're in a very, very different position now. And I think the importance of the economy growing is that the state has actually much more capacity now to do the following. To say to the very specific sectors where there are concerns about their impact in terms of the spread of the virus, that yes, we think you need to shut down to protect public health, but we as a state are in a position to compensate you for the fact that you are shutting down on our behalf. So we've got actual growth in the economy, which is something last March we never thought was going to be possible this year. The other big thing, of course, now is the vaccine being, with us, and so an end to this being on the horizon. Again, if you go back last March, I was constantly asked in interviews like this, can the state keep and borrowing and borrowing and borrowing? And the answer, of course, was no, that the huge amount of fiscal support that was being provided to the economy, it couldn't go on indefinitely. And so, the hope had been at that stage even that a vaccine would be in sight. So we have growth in the economy. There is an end in sight to this. So I think that the approach has to be close down the sectors you are really, really worried about, but make sure you compensate the business owners and the individuals, and we have the capacity as a state to do all that.
Tomás, what do you say about this? Well, we believe that it's going to be the case that non-essential retail will remain open. What will be the impact of that on case numbers?
It's true that non-essential retail probably has a much lesser contribution to transmission in the community than the hospitality sector. But evidence shows that it still contributes, particularly people working in the retail sector have a high risk of infection. In terms of getting the numbers down and crushing the curve initially, it's a good idea to close as many things as possible because it will shorten the time that it takes to crush the curve. Schools should open first. We think non-essential retail should probably open second. In terms of what Alan Barrett has said, I completely agree that support is crucial. And in our 7-point plan, point 7 is to support anybody who has their employment or their business affected by any kind of restrictions, and that's absolutely crucial. Going back to what going back to what Eoghan has said, I'm a volunteer, so I have no vested interest, and obviously Eoghan has to advocate for the travel industry. That's his job. But the reality is that most of the virus that is in Ireland today was not here before the summer. There are strains that evolved, not more pathogenic strains or more transmissible strains like the one we're worried about from England, but other innocuous or equally dangerous strains, but were not here before the summer. And so they came in through travel and tourism. The fact that our contact tracing has not identified them as such is irrelevant because they multiply once they get into the country.
Yeah, you see, it's very difficult for sectors like travel and like hospitality to accept that they're first in the firing line, as Eoghan would contend, when the data just doesn't seem to be there to support that.
The reason the data is not there is because we don't have very good disease surveillance. We don't do enough backward contact tracing. So we don't know where cases are emerging in the community. And this is a problem for trying to justify why we're closing restaurants. The reason is that internationally the evidence is overwhelming that restaurants are a site of super spreader events when you have high cases in the community. And indeed, after we opened the hospitality sector in Ireland, 2 weeks later, we see significant rises in cases. With respect to travel, the actual act of flying can be safe. There have been super spreader events on airplanes, but internationally it does look like getting on a short-haul flight can be done in a safe and responsible manner. But it's not about flying, it's about the fact of travel. It's about moving the virus from countries that have high numbers to those that have low numbers. And that is a problem.
Eoghan?
Just to respond, I don't have a vested interest, as Tomás suggested there, having to defend the travel industry. The international travel hasn't been a vector. The international data, not just Ireland, we can get obsessed with our own country, but internationally, less than 2% of cases are related to international routes. The routes that have the heaviest travel, for instance, in the summer, had the lowest caseloads within the country. It's again turning
Eoghan, it's not what happens on the plane.
Pulling up the drawbridge.
Eoghan, it's not what happens on the plane, it's about what happens when the person gets to the other side and starts circulating.
Absolutely, and the outbreaks, if you were to go through the very beginning of this, Lombardy, the resort areas were not where the problem arose. If you go to Spain, the Canary Islands, which is the playground, has the lowest rate. It's a lower rate than Ireland. The international data, and we could, very often an argument about data turns into an argument about I'm right and you're wrong, but the international data on this is that, and the aviation industry is not a business that puts safety at risk. Its history is of eliminating air crashes. And back to the economic point, it is true that our economy is going to perform very well. The pillars of the economy, software, pharmaceuticals, agri-food, some of these will even get stronger. But the part of the economy that soaks up the most jobs is hospitality. And we have about 3 months to save 2021. Tomás's strategy will be a positive in getting that right. Everybody wants to see this eliminated, the risk eliminated, and consumer confidence going back. But the number of jobs at stake in the hospitality sector is way above those of the higher performing sectors, and how long we can continue to compensate people who are out of work from that will also be a state finance issue.
Alan Barrett, you say very clearly that the supports into those sectors, they need to be beefed up, but there is that question that Eoghan poses there. How long can that continue?
Well, luckily, I think it continue for certainly into the middle, the latter part of 2021, which seems to be the timeline of the vaccine. I mean, I think it's even quite extraordinary. We're 10 months into this now, and we're still having this debate about the economy on one hand and public health on the other. To repeat points that a lot of economists have made for an awful long time, there isn't really as precise a trade-off as you would think. If the virus is rampant, and if we let things move in the direction that we're all now fearful, that will be terribly damaging for the economy. And nobody is going to be getting on flights, and nobody is going to be travelling if this thing is as rampant as we're fearful that it could get there. So I'm still amazed that a lot of the discussion is in this sort of a public health versus economic context. But the vaccine is out there. We can maintain the sort of supports. I think again, if you go back to the earlier part of the year, one of the problems is that the government was saying we'll keep the supports. I think initially it was until November, then it was extended until March. I think we can now get into the position where we can provide certainty to people to say, the supports will be in place until the vaccine has been, distributed to whatever proportion of people is needed to really get this thing under control. Okay. I just think we're in a very, very different setting now.
Tomás, to come back to you, I just want to, if you will, take us through the figures that you have modelled for the number of cases we could be seeing on a daily basis if action is not taken.
Well, our group, the Independent Scientific Advocacy Group, has done our own modelling, which is, as usual, very similar to what Nphet are predicting. But the strategic situation aside, we have an immediate tactical problem, which is what do we do over the coming days? And it's looking quite dire, because we're expecting 900 to 1,300 cases a day by December 28th and 22,000 to 4,000 cases a day by January 6th, if no action is taken. That's if no action is taken. But that doesn't include the unknowns. We don't really know how the last week, particularly last weekend, socialising is going to affect cases, the returning diaspora, and people staying with relatives, inter-county travel, and of course how people may choose to spend Christmas. So there's a lot of things happening that one can't model for.
OK, and it's your firm belief that what has been reported, the actions that are about to be taken today by Cabinet, they don't go far enough for you?
My concern is that if we put these in place, that we'll start to bend the curve after New Year's Eve, and we'll be in exactly the same position as a second wave, where as the curve is coming down, we'll spend weeks arguing about what should open and when we should open, and we'll open at 150 to 200 cases a day so that the government don't have to worry about delivering on test, trace and isolate or putting in proper quarantine. And then we'll have another wave and another lockdown.
But do you understand, if you're a restaurant owner or a hairdresser listening to this today, how devastating this is for them?
Yes, and I think it's going to be more devastating for them if we have rolling lockdowns. The problem is whenever we try and put forward a progressive proposal, that the alternative is sometimes presented as a fantasy land where we can open up and live with the virus. The reality is the status quo is we're going to have rolling lockdowns for most of 2021, and in between those lockdowns we'll be living between level 2.5 and level 3.5. We think it's evident from many other countries that the best thing you can do for the economy is to crush the virus and then to open up in a stable way. Then the economy recovers.
Tomás Ryan, Alan Barrett and Eoghan Corry, thank you all indeed for joining us today.
Always a pleasure.